Hello, everybody, and welcome to this month's Business Council for Sustainable Development Australia's Landscape Policy Intelligence session. I'm Andrew Petersen, and I'm very pleased to be hosting today's conversation with you, and also, hopefully, very soon, Professor Frank Jotzo from the Australian National University. Now, today we're focusing on carbon leakage, border carbon adjustment, and CBAM. CBAM, like a expression of action in a 1966 Batman TV series, and looking at particularly what these developments mean for Australian business, industrial climate policy, trade exposed sectors, and credible transition planning. Before we start, though, let's, as we do with all WBCSD and particularly BCSDA events, acknowledge country, and in doing so, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we are all joining today. I'm joining you from the land of the Camaragal people and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And I also acknowledge the continuing connection of First Nations peoples to land, waters, and culture. A quick note that today's session is being recorded for BCSDA purposes. And for those who have registered but were not able to attend live, there will be a recording available on our YouTube channel within about 24 hours after this session. By staying in the webinar, though, you acknowledge that you are happy for the session to be recorded, and the focus of the recording is for speaker presentation and discussion, not for individual attendee participation per se. Now, hopefully we'll run for no more than an hour, and I'll begin with a short update on the current policy landscape that BCSDA is involved in on behalf of and with its members. And then I will hopefully see Frank being able to join us to speak for around 20 minutes, and then we'll open up for a Q&A. So please put your questions into the Q&A box at any time. You don't need to wait until the end. Now, we'll aim to get through as many questions as we can. I may group the similar questions together, and I may also reframe those questions slightly so that we can keep the conversation useful for the whole audience. Before we begin, a quick reminder that BCSDA and WBCSD activities more broadly are conducted in line with antitrust and competition law requirements. Now, this is a policy intelligence and learning session, so please do not share any commercially sensitive information, including pricing, costs, margins, customers, suppliers, production volumes, market shares, procurement terms, tenders, future commercial strategy, investment intentions, or any information that could be interpreted as coordination between competitors. We don't want to discuss or agree on any collective commercial position or market allocation or boycott or pricing approach. And if a question or comment moves into a commercially sensitive territory, I may have to direct it back to the general policy and business readiness implications. Okay, after that, with all that framing in place, let's start with a short policy update before we bring in Frank into the conversation. And to do that, I will open up and dive in, I hope, to our projects. There we go. All right, the current policy landscape for BCSDA at the moment is quite a busy one, certainly out to the end of the month of June. So what you are seeing on the screen is the recording of the activities of those policy projects that we are engaged in on behalf of the members in all of the focus areas that we currently are involved in, being circular economy, cities, industry, infrastructure, innovation and mobility, climate and energy, corporate performance and accountability, nature, and then people. And for ease of reference, we've given them a color code. So in the case of circular materials and pathways, it's purple. Now, the three that are currently underway in, I think it's three, yes it is, in relation to circularity are interesting because one of them has just commenced, which is the inquiry into extended producer responsibility scheme for packaging called the No Time to Waste Bill, a bill introduced by Josh Wilson, the Australian Green Senator, and it is a private member's bill that is currently before the House for deliberation and input. It's not necessarily a bill that will in some ways go anywhere, but it's interesting that it has been raised. It comes on the back of the work on this particular issue that the New South Wales government has currently undertaken on its own EPR legislation. So it'll be interesting to see whether or not this has any legs going forward in relation to the establishment of a national EPR scheme, particularly on the topic that it highlights, which is packaging. Complete transparency, you will know that myself sits on the board of the Australian Packaging Covenant Organisation, and this is something that is obviously very much germane to and relevant around the topics of the APCO and also members of BCSDA, but also has a relevance in relation to the work of the WBCSD under the Circularity Protocol. So we have highlighted to our members that this conversation has come up. We've received feedback that they would like to make a submission to this particular inquiry, and so we'll now undertake some deep research and a further discussion with colleagues in the WBCSD, but also in our networks on the Business Coalition for a Plastics Treaty, and then bring that back into the conversation with our members in a draft hopefully a draft consultation submission paper in the next few weeks. In terms of the next, which is the Australian Recycling Facilities Standard, this was established by the Good Environmental, I always get GECA wrong, isn't that terrible? GECA and ACOR, the Australian Council on Recyclers, and they have sought feedback in relation to a consultation on the standard that they are going to introduce through GECA on the role of Australian recycling standards, recycling facilities. And that was recently a lot. In fact, I think it was only lodged last week or the week before. And so there is further deliberation that will go on. But this has an important contextual piece in relation to the first one around EPRs, because the role and relevance of MRFs, of facilities that undertake recycling of a number of different types of product are very important, because they have to be able to establish traceability and the provenance in relation to the work that they're doing, so that the businesses that are subject to the EPR will be able to show to market and obviously to the consumer, most importantly, and any obligations of mandatory requirements to government, that they are in fact undertaking an appropriate recycling process. So the standard itself is actually quite important, and we were delighted that the members were interested in making that submission. The other is that of the tyre industry. This is a very interesting one because of the consultation you would have thought doesn't have immediate reference to BCSDA and its membership. But quite interestingly, the WBCSD internationally has had a project called the Tyre Industry Project, very cleverly framed, for a number of years, and they have recently undertaken some consultation at an international level in relation to the challenges and opportunities of the establishment of an EPR-style framework under potentially other legislation through the United Nations. And so, with this opportunity coming to being, the inquiry that's been set up by the Australian Parliament was at a germane time for us to come forward and give our views as to what the WBCSD was doing, but also give some insights into what the market mechanisms might look like, and therefore what particular veracity and infrastructure needed to be put forward if a market mechanism was going to be brought forward for recycling of tyres and resource recovery, most importantly for tyres, coming forward, particularly as one learns is when you're doing this kind of really interesting and deep research, that Australia is made up of
basically two tire industries, that which is for the mining and resources sector and that which is for I guess, residential household slash small business slash business sector, which obviously has different types of needs for tires compared to mining and resources. So it's very interesting to see. And we felt that it was entirely appropriate for us to make that submission, particularly as Australia needed to be involved in a broader conversation internationally about what opportunities there were for the resource recovery, particularly of ties from the mining and resources sector. Stay tuned for that then. We've got some other news we hope that will come forward in the next few months in relation to a roundtable with some other stakeholders involved in that particular inquiry that we hope we'll be able to bring to you as members. In terms of climate, which is yellow, there was a call by the UNFCCC for inputs onto BELEM mission to 1.5. Again, this is kind of on the back of some calls that were made earlier in the year by the COP30 president in relation to two particular aspects, just transition and also deforestation, of which BCSD with its members have made submissions, and we are now waiting for some consultation processes that's about to occur on those particular topics. It will be a very interesting one, which we will come through after some deep research, which we are undertaking at the moment in consultation with the WBCSD, because they've also indicated that they may well make a submission on that as well. So there's an opportunity perhaps of coordinated action. All right, let's move on to corporate performance and accountability. And the big news was the ACCC has reached out to BCSDA, who has made quite a number of submissions over a number of years in relation to sustainability claims. You may remember even last year we had the chair of the ACCC give the keynote address at the Fiona Wayne Oration in 2025. Well, this time they're looking for input in relation to a guide that they're developing for business that is subject to the ACCC obligations under its act, under its respective acts, under making emissions claims. And so this, I think, has already gone out for consultation. We're waiting for input from the members, and we will be then providing that back to the ACCC in the not too distant future. It's interesting that they are very active in trying to support and assist business in its transition around not so much obligations under the AASB or ASRS in particular, but looking at the broader aspects of those claims that are made over time. And so you can look forward to seeing this published, I think, probably no later than the end of the calendar year. In fact, it might be in Q3 of 2026. And it would be one that you would need to include on your register of checklists that you are undertaking when you are doing a internal assessment of not so much greenwashing, but validation of claims in relation to emissions and the transition pathways that you're making. Our friends at the World Benchmarking Alliance have been undertaking a very comprehensive root and branch review of the databases and the access to the information that they've been undertaking for a number of years now, and the way that they're going to be in the future, looking at benchmarking companies against the individual indices, climate, nature, society, and I think a couple of others, which I can't remember off the top of my head. But these particular benchmarking elements are going to be then turned into a one-style benchmark assessment, rather than looking at the individual elements of climate and nature and so forth. And so in that, they've been asking for allies, of which BCSD Australia is one, has been asked to give some feedback in relation to that particular transition assessment integration that they're planning. That has already been, I think, developed, and they have been asking through a survey approach for that response. That's been sent out to Lean and Learn members for their feedback, and I think, have highlighted that individual members can make any submissions that they wish to directly, but that will be done shortly. Now, what's important about that is that that information is now used by a lot of different investors and standard setters in relation to how to look at particular baselines of information that companies have as to these particular inputs. And with that, it's important, I think, that we contribute as Australian companies into what is important from Australian expectations for that baseline information to be provided. Conscious that I think of the 2,000 companies that they benchmarked last, and I think they announced in March of this year, at least 100 are in there that are Australian or Australian related. So it's not as if there's not nothing in there that's not relevant to Australian business to be looking at. Okay, next is the work that we have just begun with the AASB on the consultation that they're interested in having with members in Australia, but also in conjunction with the WBCSD on SASB. For those of you who may not be aware, SASB is going through an interesting iteration inside the International Sustainability Standards Board and potentially may have ongoing impact into Australian business through the through the ASRS, through AASB 1, S1 and S2. And the question is, should that happen? And so there's some interesting consultation that's about to occur in the month of June and into July with our colleagues of AASB and the WBCSD in anticipation of submissions being made to the ISSB. There's an awful lot of acronyms going on here. And for that, the members will become aware of that through a briefing paper in the next few weeks, with a view to certain members who are very interested in being involved in this, being involved in a roundtable with AASB and the WBCSD through Marty McBride, who a number of you may know, in the next few, certainly by the end of June, and then rolling out into potentially a submission sometime in the third quarter of this year. The second last is to remind you that the parliamentary inquiry on greenwashing is not dead, in fact, far from it, and that the committee report is now due on the 25th of June. So this next landscape is being held on the 24th of June. So we won't be able to tell you what it says because it happens the day after, but I thought it was important to remind you and advise you that if you are needing to prepare your internal teams, particularly corporate affairs or external affairs, about what any implications of the greenwashing report and its recommendations might be, it's time to start getting ready for how you're going to respond when it lands on the 25th of June. Now, the expectation is that there is going to be largely a conversation that ever since they've set the inquiry up, a lot of work has happened. AASB has come into being with S1 and S2, and therefore, and with the work of the ACCC, APRA and ASIC, you now have all of the regulatory functions in place that are starting to look at the way in which claims being made by companies, particularly on climate-related risk, are being identified and reported. The question is, will they look into others? And this is where the interest in relation to the greenwashing report, I think, is also going to be relevant. And obviously, feedback from the inquiry into the ACCC process is obviously going to be something that is relevant as well. Finally, on corporate performance and accounting, the GRI have out a set of draft pollution standards, which are still in a work in progress. And whilst that does not affect each and every member of the BCSDA, it is relevant because the work of the GRI does inform now the work of the ISSB. And so it's quite helpful and relevant, I think, for us to make submission because there are a number of companies in Australia, and we have members that do use the GRI. We know that because when we do the Reporting Matters Review performance assessment, we see the GRI standards prevalent in quite a number of member reports. And therefore, the standard setting in relation to pollution is going to be something that will come down the line and be needed to be reported extant and separate from obligations under ASRS, but increasingly they may become relevant under S1. And so it's helpful to look at what that's going to mean in terms of what the standards that could be set by the GRI that could then flow into and inform whatever is the reporting obligations going forward in relation to risk identified under S1, under ISSB1, and then ultimately flow back into Australia. Okay, in terms of nature, there's a whole suite of work that's about to start. In fact, it's going to start, I think, tomorrow, around the national environment standards for matters of national environmental significance. There are a variety of different papers out at the moment from DCU in relation to the work under the EPBCA, and we will be again providing deep research and then looking at what submissions need to be made based on the membership interests of those particular areas and issues, and then coming back to the members to seek their insights before those submissions are made. I think they have to be made by the end of June, if I'm not mistaken. In terms of people, and that's red or ochre, I think we call it, there's a couple, and the most recent is the Modern Slavery Bill in New Zealand. For those of you who may not know, New Zealand has not to date had formal legislation in relation to modern slavery, but it's about to introduce or has a bill before the House of the New Zealand Parliament. And with that, a number of Australian member companies are impacted by what that particular bill will say. And so what is important for you all to understand is that if you do have interest in this, and then I think the draft submission from myself was sent out earlier today to the Lean and Learn members and also to our board. And with that, it would be good if we had your submissions back by no later than 1 o'clock on Thursday, the 28th of May. Why? Because the close of submissions is, if I can't remember, it's either close of business or midnight or 11:59 p.m. on the 28th of May, New Zealand time. So we need to make sure that we are putting our submission in by then. We have been in consultation with our colleagues at Sustainable Business Council New Zealand, and they have very kindly provided a copy of their draft submission, which we have also circulated to members to understand what is the position of New Zealand headquartered companies. There are some slight, from what I can tell, some slight variations and differences and important differences that Australian companies need to make submission on, and that's why we've made I don't think it will be possible to do it combined submission unless, and my colleague Mike Burrell thinks that that's the way to go, but we are entirely consistent with what we're saying, but there are further matters that I think are important for BCSD members to highlight in a submission to the New Zealand Parliament. So for those members who have not seen it but would like to see it, tell me in the chat function and I will make sure that we send a copy to you as well. But I think I did a fairly good due diligence to make sure that those members who I knew were have operations or value chain in New Zealand did receive a copy of it. Also, just to highlight, just for transparency, we did make a submission to the Select Committee on Taxation of Gas Resources. To be clear, our submission was neither pro or anti the introduction of tax in relation to gas resources. What we said was this was a fundamentally important moment in time to think very deeply about how we affected important policy frameworks for topics like this. And therefore, you needed to take into account certain indicia when you were thinking about introducing this kind of fiscal introduction. And that's kind of different to everybody else's submission. We know that because we went and looked at everybody else's submission. But the point being, and this kind of echoed what we said in our pre-budget submission, was that it's one thing to talk about whether we should or we shouldn't have these things. What we need to talk about is what's the preconditions for thinking about why we need them, and are we putting in the proper frameworks into our deliberations so that we don't think about them at the crisis moment. We think about them in our long term. And so we were pleased, particularly when Treasury Chalmers talked about intergenerational equity as one of the key underlying drivers for this particular budget, but we recommended that they go further. And so you can go and have a look at our pre-budget submission. I'm pretty sure it's on our website. And the submission that we've made on taxation of gas resources will go up on our website as well in the not too distant future. But it's arguing about a different way of thinking about, a more sustainable way of thinking about how you bring about good policy to affect improvement in relation to environmental, social, and governance outcomes. The other two, yes, the other two are really quite fascinating because they have involved me, in fact, being in front of the inquiries themselves in the month of May. The first was the inquiry into factors shaping social license and economic development outcomes in critical minerals projects. This was a very interesting opportunity to give some discussion about the work that some of our members are doing on behalf of the critical minerals industry and how that work should be used as opportunities for baselining certain certain practical and protocol practices by the industry going forward. But we also highlighted the opportunity of thinking about leading practice guidelines that could be used in thinking about these projects even before they come into fruition, so that communities understood and had clarity around what things like closure would look like, what things would look like in terms of First Nations engagement. And so we're hopeful that there will be some reference to the ideas that we put forward. Again, our submission, I'm pretty sure, is now up on our website. And if somebody doesn't find it, call me out and tell me. But it's really interesting that they were more interested in the practical ideas that we came forward with rather than what is social license, should we define it? We said you just can't. So, but you can talk about what some of the benefits of having an emphasis on social license in relation to project approval or project deliberation and approval could look like. That kind of applied in the same way to the national employment standards. This was a really interesting inquiry, can I tell you? Not the least of which is I had to go to Warwick Farm, which I haven't been to for years. But they held the inquiry in Sydney, in Warwick Farm, in the heart of the southwest. And it was really interesting, again, that what they were looking for was not a conversation about a root and branch review of what was established as national employment standards some years ago, in fact, only I think about 3 years ago, but what were the practical steps that needed to be taken so that you could baseline behavioural aspects of it for both employers and employees post-COVID that would ensure that people had a clear line of sight about leading practice within businesses. And that meant around things like gender issues, disability, work from home, labour practices. And so we came up with some ideas as to what was a good idea for indicia that would be thought of that any business, large, medium or small, could actually undertake in a very short form checklist that could show over time to both the business and also to the employees what better employment practice was going to look like with the application of the standards. Again, we don't know if any of this will be approved, but we do know that in the case of both of these, their inquiry reports, I think, have to come out by no later than the end of the next quarter 3. So it'll be interesting to see. And in the case of the national employment standards, it does have an application to member companies above a certain threshold, which I've completely forgotten at this point of the conversation. So I hope that that was helpful in relation to where we were up to. As always, in the case of the consultation, we have what's called Consult Watch, which we look at every week to ascertain whether or not there are matters of importance for members that we will then bring forward, both research and submissions, for them to deliberate on and give us guidance as to whether or not they, in fact, think that the organisation should have a submission in relation to that particular topic. So as a member, that is something that is highlighted both in ESG Snapshot, which is our weekly newsletter, but also for those members at a higher member category that have a deeper involvement in relation to the policy framework that we establish on these things. We get your input and your feedback as to whether or not we should, and then what particular aspects we then highlight. So we are constantly and deeply grateful for the information that is provided by members and also the inputs that they provide on examples on occasions that we can include in those particular submissions. All right, let's now stop hearing from me and hear from our guest. Frank, do you want to open up? There he is. Welcome, welcome, welcome. And this is a conversation that has been long to wait for, particularly by me, because Frank very kindly agreed to do this particular conversation some many months ago, but then has become so popular on a variety of different aspects of the work that he's working on that he wasn't able to do it either the last month or the month before. Yeah, it was March, I think we originally discussed the possibility of this. So I'm very excited that you're able to join us, and thank you so much for being available to do this. For those of you who don't know who Frank is the Professor of Environmental and Climate Change Economics at the ANU, the Australian National University's Crawford School of Public Policy, which, just as a sidebar, if I remember correctly, so was our current chair, Professor Dr. John Hewson, some many years ago. Frank is also the director of the Centre for Climate and Energy Policy and the head of energy at the Australian National University Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions. And then on Tuesday, now, Frank's work focuses on climate change economics, energy transition, decarbonisation, zero emissions industries, economic policy instruments for climate change, and international dimensions on climate policy. And just as importantly, and it's very relevant for this year because it's Kickstart all over again, he was also held lead author roles in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, including the fifth and the sixth assessment reports. And if you've got any intel on the seventh, please tell us. And was involved in a number of major climate policy advisory processes. But today, most importantly, and most relevantly, the discussion is about what Frank has been involved in the last, let's say, probably 12 months, which was an appointment that he had to lead the Australian Carbon Leakage Review. Now, that review examined the extent of carbon leakage risk, considered whether additional policy options were needed, and the look at the feasibility of a CBAM, a carbon border adjustment mechanism for Australia. Now, my understanding is the DCC, the Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment and Water, has now completed the review, and the report's recommendations are due to be considered in this current cycle of review for the safeguard mechanism. So I think Frank is so well placed to help us understand not just the theory of leakage of carbon, but the practical implications for Australian business and particularly trade exposed sectors. And can I say, Frank, as a sidebar, our colleagues at WBCSD are very, very interested to watch the recording of this to understand what the impact of this is going to be to Australian operations of WBCSD members in Australia. So thank you for joining us. I might now hand over to you. I think I've given you access to the option to be able to show slides. And so with that, welcome and over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew. I'm really happy that it's working out. Really excited to be able to speak to you all about this topic. And thanks for the overly long introduction. So yeah, some of my best friends are in the seventh assessment cycle of the IPCC, and I think it's no grand secret to reveal that it's a hard wicket there and slow going actually with the IPCC because the political influences on the process are ever greater as we're going forward on that one. Okay, so thanks for the opportunity to present about the findings and recommendations of the Australian Carbon Leakage Review. So just before I show just a few slides about the process and the timeline. So this is a review that was initiated by the Australian government, by Minister Bowen for the Australian Cabinet. I was appointed in late 2023. Yes, as lead of the external lead of the review. It was a review done within government, but led by an external person, namely myself. with the terms of reference determined by government. And Andrew, you characterize it correctly. The status of the recommendations is that the findings of the review and the recommendations will now be considered as part of the review of the safeguard mechanism, which is to unfold over the course of the coming financial year. Okay. We delivered the carbon leakage review report to the Australian government in February 2025, and it was released publicly in February 2026. And so a little bit of water has gone down the creek in terms of government processes for consideration, whatever might sit behind that. Okay, so let me just run you through some of the highlights. I'll keep this brief so we've got a bit of time for discussion. Very happy to answer any questions. Really, here we go. So carbon leakage, the definition that we took to carbon leakage in this review is one that's really strictly focused on climate change policy. It's the relocation of industrial production from a jurisdiction with climate policy or strong climate policy to a jurisdiction without climate policy or with weak policy, purely on the basis of that difference in policy or policy intensity, right? So industrial relocation that happens as a result of changing comparative advantage, labor costs, locational factors, industry policy, whatever, doesn't meet the definition of carbon leakage, right? It is solely and purely about the difference in climate change policy. And a driving factor here in Australia is, of course, the safeguard mechanism. So Australian industrial and resource facilities are captured by the safeguard mechanism with an increasing obligation to reduce emissions and cover an increasing share of their emissions intensive production through credits, which is not the case in some of the countries that we trade with. So that's the fundamental motivation for these considerations. Principles guiding the review, as I help define them. Firstly, the idea here is economically efficient, low and zero emissions industrial production. That's the long-term goal, right? So it's not about protection of existing industrial facilities or structures, right? It's about helping create a durable market-based system to help bring about investments in low and zero emissions industries for the future. Secondly, recognizing Australia's opportunity as a producer and exporter of clean energy and industrial goods. Okay, so helping bring about that renewable energy superpower vision. And thirdly, a very central recognition of the fact that trade is important to Australia and will always be. The international rules-based trading system, free and open liberal trade relationships of enormous importance to Australia, and no policy instrument in the climate policy space should compromise that in any way. By contrast, any such policy instrument should actually be an enhancer of the international trading system and free and open trade for Australia. The findings on carbon leakage risk were that the current policy settings, safeguard with trade exposed baseline adjustment for some industrial installations is adequate in the short term, but over time, there's potentially a material carbon leakage risk emerging, in particular for a small list of commodities, including the cement, clinker lime group, ammonia, steel, glass, aluminum and alumina, refined petroleum products and paper, right? So the team at DQ did an enormous job there in very original data analysis as well for us to arrive at that conclusion. Policy options considered in the review to address emerging carbon leakage risk, quite a number of them. But Andrew, as you pointed out, the attention has really been focused on border carbon adjustment mechanisms. Now, what do we mean by border carbon adjustment? Well, a border carbon adjustment, or BOCA, as you might call it, seeks to equalize carbon costs across different jurisdictions, right? And so if we have a carbon cost in Australia for industrial production here, and we've got imports of the same commodity from elsewhere, so cement or clinker imported from Malaysia or Japan or wherever, where it doesn't face an equivalent carbon price signal, then we should make sure that that same carbon price signal is affected at the border on importation to create a level playing field between Australia-based producers and producers situated anywhere else that ship to Australia, right? So the EU already has a system like that in place. Beginning of this calendar year, it became financially effective. UK is implementing it. Canada at various points in time considered it greatly complicated, of course, now with the trade relationship with the US as it stands. Korea, Taiwan considering or implementing. Now, findings on applicability and recommendations there. Consider it for some selected commodities. Consider it only for imports to Australia in a way that mirrors domestic policy settings to imports. Don't provide export rebates. Make sure it's consistent with WTO and other international trade obligations, and take opportunities to support progress in international initiatives such as the Integrated Forum for Carbon Mitigation Approaches under the OECD. Yeah, so no export border carbon adjustment. Happy to go into that in detail if there's interest in the discussion. Design considerations, do it in a way that transaction costs are low, do it in a way that import duties are payable only in cases where two conditions are met, namely one, emissions intensity of production of the imported good is higher than the safeguard benchmark, and two, the policy effort applied to that production in the country of origin is lower than that in Australia. Possible first movers, cement, clinker, and lime. The problem is likely to be, if there is a problem, likely to be most pronounced in that product group. And at the same time, the challenges in implementation are probably among the most manageable in those products which are relatively homogeneous and easy to trace. Possible later additions for border carbon adjustment, product group around ammonia and derivatives, quite important potentially to help the emergence of a green ammonia industry in Australia. Potentially steel, complicated issues to consider there, as well as glass potentially, and maybe further down the track, other commodities. Revenue, always a question with border carbon adjustment, strong emphasis on revenue, often misunderstandings as to who actually pays for any of these border carbon adjustments. Is actually, end consumers in the countries of importation rather than producers. Also, revenue that such a mechanism would generate is probably quite small. Actually, that's the European experience as well. Also important to note that if a border carbon adjustment was implemented as part of the safeguard that's of course one of the many advantages that that would exist in this way. Now, if we project forward, right, then we could see the vision of a kind of a growing web of to want a border carbon adjustment implemented, right? Same considerations as for Australia-based industries. And the interesting thing, of course, is this is by and large also in the interest of Australian industry to see border carbon adjustments in other countries, because this is what will underpin the market for green commodities produced in Australia and exported elsewhere. If we take seriously the vision of green iron produced at scale in Australia and exported to Asian countries, we take seriously the notion of green fertilizer, green ammonia, green fuels produced in Australia and exported elsewhere, then it is carbon pricing and a border carbon adjustment in the importing countries that will create green market premiums for Australian product and that make that kind of vision possible. So thanks very much for the opportunity and happy to discuss anything really that you would like.
Thank you for that. Yeah, let's start with the broadest question of all. What's the most important carbon leakage or border adjustment signal, do you think, that Australian businesses should be watching for in 2026? Is it the sheer fact of the deliberation through the mechanism, or do you think, given Australia's announcement with its FTA with the EU and what's going on everywhere else in the world at the moment, and conscious, I think it was Friday that the World Bank came out with that really interesting insight in relation to the size of carbon markets around the world. Do you think that there are signals that are coming up that are important from the perspective of the work that you did?
Look, I think the most important considerations and developments relate to policy decisions that this present federal government might make with regard to a safeguard mechanism, right? And so, a safeguard review is there in order to review the settings of the safeguard mechanism and some design features as an opportunity to iron out some wrinkles and potentially increase the stringency of that policy, and so strengthen the signal that it provides for clean investments. And so I was listening to the Senate estimates hearing this morning of the Environment Comms Committee, where the carbon leakage review and border carbon adjustment was in fact a topic. And Minister Ayres made it quite clear that government views the safeguard mechanism review as the check-in point to potentially strengthen scheme settings for greater effectiveness. And so, I think the review analyzed and found quite clearly and explained quite clearly how a border carbon adjustment could serve as part of a suite of measures that could be taken to strengthen the safeguard mechanism, fundamentally by removing the carbon leakage concern once and for all for any commodity where you apply a border carbon adjustment. Right? It's a once and for all solution for these things. That would require, some element of administrative machinery there, right, in terms of determining the emissions intensity and policy effort in imported materials, right? That's why we want to start only with the simple commodities, if you want, right? Cement, clinker, lime, these kinds of things. But solve that problem, right? And by solving that problem, you're also arriving at a more solid policy basis for the entire safeguard mechanism that way, right? As a result of solving the carbon leakage concern, industry considerations around the stringency of the safeguard mechanism should also be attenuated somewhat, right? Because a rising price for safeguard credits, right, does not then translate into rising concerns about international competitiveness, right? It just simply translates into a rising incentive to invest in cleaner production technology, right? But look, how will government position on these issues? I wouldn't be able to tell.
Yeah. Okay. Let's talk about the exporters and Australian exporters into those markets that currently have such a scheme, um, or let's broaden it out by saying they've got stronger carbon constraints. Did you explore what any of the practical implications of these CBAM-style policies overseas have yielded?
Yeah, so the European CBAM is the one that's in operation, and also, given that the EU emissions trading scheme has the highest price level of any comparable scheme,
Yeah, yeah.
any relevant large-scale scheme in the world, that's the most relevant to watch, right? Um, and it's the EU CBAM is not a big deal for Australian industry and exporters because there's an extremely small amount of industrial production of the types of commodities captured by the EU CBAM that actually goes from Australia to Europe, right?
Mm,
So it's not a meaningfully large a practical issue for us. However, you can, of course, extrapolate to, say, Korea,
yes,
developing such an instrument in future, and then it becomes a real live issue
yes,
for
that's right.
them.
Yep.
And so that's where you will see a competitive advantage for Australian green production emerge, right?
Hmm.
And so take the archetypal example of converting iron ore in the Pilbara or in South Australia to iron using renewable energy as the energy input, right? So then you have a low emissions, near zero emissions product, right? Iron that competes with high emissions product
Hmm.
into the EU, into Korea in those examples, right? And the application of a CBAM at the border will give the price advantage to the Australian-made green product
Mm.
compared, for example, to the conventionally produced product from elsewhere, right? So that's what you want to look for. Now, it's also important issues in administration of such a scheme. How do you trace emissions intensity and so forth? What you will want to avoid, what the global community will want to avoid, is a sort of a spaghetti system
Yes,
of lots of different schemes, right? Each
yes.
country, their own requirements for data collection and reporting and documentation, creating enormous administrative effort and cost, right? And so, what I've been emphasizing as part of the carbon leakage review is the opportunity to foster an internationally harmonized system
Yep,
that could be shepherded by the OECD, for
yep,
example,
yep.
and where Australia could be a prime mover in making this happen, right?
Mm.
Maybe together with Korea, right? And that system may well look a little bit different from the European one, because the European one is really tailored to the EU ETS, and at least in its original incarnation, very much reflects a sort of a Brussels appetite for um, for complexity over practicality, right? The original data collection spreadsheet for the EU CBAM had 10,000 rows to be
Yeah,
filled in.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And that's really not what you want. You
It,
want
it,
something simple and you want something consistent that's internationally harmonized. And I really do believe that opportunity exists and will continue to exist for a few years to actually, create such an internationally harmonized system. And if Australia takes the decision to go towards a border carbon adjustment, then I think we can hope that Australia would be a force in creating such an international system.
no, I think it's a real good call to action, actually. And your idea of the role of the OECD is quite a germane one because Australia has punched above its weight, particularly in relation to multinational non-government enterprise policy work through the OECD for a number of years. Yeah, so it's a really interesting observation. Last question, and it's a bit of a cheat, but given we are a business oriented organization, I'll ask the question. What should boards be asking management this year about carbon leakage, trade exposure, or transition credibility? It's probably a bit lengthy, but in your observation, and you've been in this space for so many years, you've obviously seen the twos and fros of the way in which boards have been treating the climate agenda. But in 2026, even with all of the so-called rupture that is going on, to use the word of Prime Minister Mark Carney, what should a strategically minded, risk averse but risk appetite, opportunity focused business in Australia should they be thinking about?
If you're a board member of an industrial company in particular, or
Yeah.
perhaps of a major financial organization that has influence over industrial investment decisions and resource sector investment decisions, then a question you need to be asking at this point is, how are we positioned medium to longer term for our business to thrive in a global industrial and energy system that does actually shift away from fossil fuels, right? And the transition away from fossil fuels, right? It's the new label that's plastered on these things, including the Santa Marta conference, right?
Yep.
We were at that, helping shepherd part of that process. That's really taking off. And, you know, the present energy supply crunch really is putting the spotlight on the vulnerabilities in the fossil fuel supply chains, right? And, you know, it kind of looks sweet in some ways for fossil fuel producers and exporters because of elevated price in the short term. But medium to longer term, fossil fuel users, fossil fuel importers will accelerate their efforts to get away from fossil fuels, in part because of the very bitter experience that's being made right now, just how vulnerable the system is to random interventions by global powers. Okay.
Yeah.
And so that's coming. And so the question is, what's the opportunities and how is your company positioned to benefit from that opportunity? And, you know, I mean, just one very proximate thing, fertilizers, right? So in Australia, massive agricultural producer and exporter, we're reliant on imports for about 2/3 of our fertilizer needs, right? All of urea, okay? And that's all gas and coal based from somewhere else, okay? What's in Australia is largely gas-based, right? And it can all be wind and solar energy-based, right? Where you have zero concerns about supply disruption, you have zero concern about price-based fertilizer, fossil fuel price-based fertilizer availability crunches or anything, right? We can put this longer term all on the basis of renewable energy, Haber-Bosch processes, right? With domestic supply of fertilizer on a zero carbon basis. Is your business positioned to be part of a supply chain like that? If the answer is yes, right, get your management to investigate what the options actually might be, and how to not have that door slammed in our faces by that kind of production capacity being established in the Middle East before we get a foot in.
Yeah. Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you so much, Frank. That was really very clear and a timely discussion on what I think in one respect was historically a complex policy area, but I think you've made it much clearer through your review work. And I think that the government is eager to, as you say, make it a effective and I was going to say simple, that's not necessarily the right word, but a clear and concise way of being involved in the constraints that exist in the climate transition as between borders, and in doing so in such a way that business extracts the most value, finds the opportunity, and where it's necessary has a low-cost compliance to do that. And I know that our members and our broader audience will find that very useful. So in winding up, thank you so much to those who've been able to join us today, and for those of you who did submit questions. Before we close, two quick dates for your diary. Our next exchange is on the 15th of June, the day before my birthday. Put that in your diary. And our next landscape will be on the 24th of June, and we'll circulate the registration links after today's session. Also, don't forget that if you're not receiving ESG Snapshot, I really do encourage you to sign up. As a member, it's part of your membership benefit, and we will make sure that you get it in a very timely fashion. It comes out 9 o'clock every single Monday, except for last Monday where I was a tiny bit late. But it is BCSDA's plain English intelligence service that covers climate, nature, circularity, equity, people, and corporate accountability signals for business, both here and overseas. And I'm really excited by the fact that it has a new resource section so that you've got the tools that you need in relation to the implementation challenge that now exists from turning ambition into that implementation on opportunity. In a final close, thank you so much for joining Landscape today, and we look forward to seeing you at the next session. And as I always say when I close out, I look forward to seeing you somewhere in the future. Bye for now.